Hello everyone, welcome back to our Bible study. We are in the book of Ruth. We started Ruth yesterday, and today we're talking about chapter 2. So this is a short book. I've actually finished all the outlines for it, and you can find them online at tobelikechrist.com, including the one that you're going to see up on the screen right now. Let's answer our first question. When did the events of this chapter happen? Well, the events recorded in the book of Ruth took place during the period of the Judges, which was the last book that we talked about. Most scholars place the period of the Judges between 1450 and 1000 BC. One thing we find out is that Ruth was the great-grandmother of a really important Bible character that we'll read about in the next couple books, and that is King David. She was his great-grandmother. Now, most scholars place David's birth somewhere around 1040 BC. There's some debate about that, but if we place it in 10,000, if we place it in 1040, then Ruth being David's great-grandmother, her story probably took place somewhere around 1100 BC. This chapter specifically mentions the barley and wheat harvest in Israel. And just for your information, barley and wheat were planted in the autumn and then harvested in the spring. Barley typically ripened faster, and it was harvested sometime around April, whereas the wheat was harvested around May. Where did these events play out geographically? Well, in chapter 1, we talked about Ruth and Naomi moving from Moab to Bethlehem, and basically the rest of the book of Ruth takes place in and around the city of Bethlehem. You may know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but this was about 1,000 years earlier, 1,100 years earlier. Two of our characters we were already introduced to in the last chapter, but we've got a new one to talk about today. First, we've got Naomi. She was an Israelite woman who was a widow. Her husband Elimelech died in the country of Moab. Ruth was her daughter-in-law. Ruth was a Moabite woman. She wasn't an Israelite woman. And she was also a widow. She had married Naomi's son, Mahlon, but he had died in Moab as well. So now this mother-in-law and daughter-in-law are widows, and they've returned to Bethlehem after their grief. Now, Boaz is going to come into the picture here. Boaz was a relative of Naomi's. Seemed like a pretty wealthy man, we'll find out. He's described as, quote, a worthy man. Now over to our outline section. Section number 1, verses 1 through 7, Ruth gleans in the field of Boaz. So at the time of the barley harvest in the spring, Ruth decided to go to one of the farmer's fields and glean. Now, gleaning was the practice of somebody going into a recently harvested field and picking up the grain that had been dropped or left behind by the harvesters. And this was common practice among the poor in Israel. In fact, God wanted it to be that way. God forbid farmers from going back and picking up the things that they left behind in their own fields because it was supposed to be left for the poor so that the poor would have something to eat. By chance, or rather by providence, we'll find out, Ruth went to the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz, when he came to his field to inspect the work, he asked his manager about Ruth. He inquired after her, and his manager said this about her, quote, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." In verses 8 through 17, Ruth and Boaz meet for the first time. Boaz approached Ruth, and he spoke very kindly to her, and he gave her permission to continue gleaning in his field. He gave her permission to drink the water that his servants, that his laborers had drawn from the well. And this kindness was somewhat unusual, and so Ruth bowed to the ground, and she inquired as to why Boaz was being kind to her of all people. He told her that it was because he had heard about her love for Naomi, her mother-in-law, and how she cared for her after the death of her husband, Elimelech, which was one of Boaz's relatives. Boaz also invited Ruth to come and to eat at his table with his workers. And he even told his laborers to leave grain behind intentionally for Ruth to gather. And at the end of the day, Ruth had collected about an ephah of barley. That's about 35 liters. So that's quite a substantial amount. As the day came to a close, that brings us to our last section, verses 18 through 23. Ruth tells Naomi, about Boaz. So when Ruth returned home to Naomi, Naomi was surprised to see the quantity of barley that she had collected, and she knew that somebody must have been generous to Ruth. Ruth told Naomi about Boaz, and Naomi recognized him as one of her relatives. She calls him one of their redeemers, which we'll talk about that term in the upcoming chapters. It's kind of the major theme of the book of Ruth, the redemption or the redeemer. Naomi encouraged her daughter-in-law to continue gleaning in Boaz's field, and that's exactly what she did until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest. And now finally for our application section, this is an idea that's kind of fascinated me recently, the involvement of God in the small decisions of our lives. God is probably more involved in the everyday decisions of your life than you may realize. We find out in the rest of this book and in the rest of the Bible that it was God's will for Ruth and Boaz to meet. It was God's will for Ruth to go to his particular field that day. Question: what was it, though, when you break it down into small individual decisions, what was it that caused Ruth to go into Boaz's field instead of into the field of, some other man, some other farmer? Well, it could have been a million things, right? Maybe she saw an acquaintance there that she knew, and she said, oh, I'll go over there because my friend's over there. Maybe Boaz was the only farmer who was harvesting that day because his crops had ripened earlier than everybody else's. Maybe it was just that Boaz's field was the closest one to her house, and so that's the one she went to. Whatever it was that drew her to Boaz's field, it had been prearranged by God. And the application for us and what we need to take away from this and understand is that our daily decisions, many of which seem very inconsequential, which direction we turn when we walk out of our house or something like that, they are part of a great chain of cause and effect, which goes back to the beginning of time, which God uses to bring about his will in the world. In the life of, if you think about it, there's 8 billion people in the world. God is working in every one of their lives. He has to be organizing all of these details in an incredible, masterful way. When you begin to think about how this works on a small scale, you realize that the direction that you turn when you walk out of the grocery store may have massive implications on the direction of your life. Whether you leave for work at 11 a.m. or 11:05 a.m. may be the difference between two totally different destinies. Only God knows that. We can never know that. Only God has a mind that can fit all of those pieces together in the life of 8 billion people. Our job is to trust that he is going to put all the pieces together and put them in the right place.